70 plus people have joined the webinar. And so I'd like to welcome you all and to begin on behalf of the Diplomacy Training Programme to say thank you very much indeed for making the time to join us this afternoon, this morning, this evening, from wherever you are. Myself and my colleague Claire and our friend and colleague Joshua Cooper are joining you from Suva in Fiji, where we're here for a meeting of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. But the Diplomacy Training Programme is normally on the lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney at the Faculty of Law and Justice. And I begin all of our webinars by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land there that we have our offices on, to recognise the traditional owners, to recognise their right to self-determination, to recognise we are on land that was never ceded and that the struggle for self-determination is a continuing one. And it's particularly appropriate, of course, to the subject of the webinar that we're running today, focused on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. In acknowledging the land and the traditional owners, we'd also like to pay the respects of the Diplomacy Training Programme, my respects also to elders past and present, and to all of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining the webinar today. There is a profound respect from the Diplomacy Training Programme for the struggles for self-determination. The rights of Indigenous peoples in Australia and globally has been a part of the Diplomacy Training Programme's work since we began our capacity building on human rights and Indigenous peoples' rights over 35 years ago. I should also acknowledge that the support of Oxfam Australia in making this webinar possible and the support of the Swiss Embassy in Canberra. So this webinar focused on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the second in a series we're running, a series of 3 initially, based on the sense that it's really important to build greater understanding and respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples and the key standard, the UN Declaration. We're joined by 3 wonderful individuals and experts in the area who will take us through different aspects of the declaration and how it's being implemented. And so it's a great honour to welcome to the space Dr. Albert Barume, who is the recently appointed as the new UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Dr. Albert Barume has a very long record of working for the rights of Indigenous peoples, has considerable expertise in the area, and is a former chairperson and member of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples too. He has a PhD in international law. We're also joined by Les Malezer, the founding chair of the Foundation for Aboriginal Islander Research and Action. And Les will be familiar to many of you for his lifelong work in advancing the rights of Indigenous peoples and his pivotal role in the development and adoption of the UN Declaration. And it's also a great honour to welcome Ngarra Murray, who is co-chair of the Victorian First Peoples Assembly and who is really at the forefront of struggles here in Australia as well to gain recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples. We've asked Albert to kick things off for us, really, to share a little bit about his role, the importance of that role in helping and advising governments and others in the implementation of the declaration. Then we've asked Les to share a bit more in terms of the content and substance of the declaration and particular elements of the declaration. And then finally, we'll come to Ngarra to look at some of the processes going on in Victoria now, the truth-telling and treaty-making processes, and seeing how do they relate to the declaration, how can the declaration inform and guide those processes, what can be done there in Victoria to help with implementation. So that's the rough structure. We've asked each of the speakers to speak for about 15 minutes. And then we will go to questions and discussion. And as I say, please use the chat function to put any questions or comments. We'll use the chat function to put relevant links and information there. All of the presentations will be shared with you afterwards in a recording of the webinar. So the webinar will be recorded and shared with everybody, as will the presentations, as will the links and the questions and comments in the chat. So thank you again, everybody, for coming today. And it's a great pleasure, Albert, to ask you to start us off. Thank you. Sorry, Albert.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you to the Center for Diplomacy for this opportunity. Thank you for Claire. Thank you for everybody online, including my dear friend Les, with whom we just had had a wonderful tour in Australia. It's really a pleasure to talk quickly, but unlike what Patrick have just said, I thought to take you have sort of in a nutshell my look of understanding of really quickly of the UN declaration that probably my colleague Les will supplement. And then eventually spending maybe my last 5 minutes talking to you about the mandate itself. The mandate itself is a pretty standard thing. Many of you are aware of it. But anyway, let me share my screen if that would be still possible. It's not it's never. Okay, I think this is it. Can everybody see it? So really taking you through the declaration, and again, in a nutshell, really in a very quick nutshell, which I'm absolutely certain Les will go into detail, because the like of Les literally went through every single wording of that text for over 20 years. So he will tell you all the nitty-gritty, all the bottlenecks that they went through. But me, in a nutshell, and every time I'm asked for 5 minutes or 2 to talk about the declaration, I really see it's important. For me, every single legal text, it's important to know why it was written. It really doesn't matter what is written in a text, but it's clearly important to know why it was written. So I thought one or two slides on the purpose, summary content, and really featuring that text in the current global context. These are really rapidly a few sort of set of slides I want to talk about. And there is just one slide on the purpose, actually. In my view, the declaration was meant for 4 purposes. Wherever you read from Article 1 to the last one, that text was written for 4 major purposes, which are clearly through the preamble. The preamble that's where you find the spirit of a text. The preamble is clearly, on one occasion, recognizing indigenous peoples as peoples and nation. That is very clear. This text meant to correct something that the humanity did wrong, not to recognize indigenous as nation and as people. Obviously, that had suffered from historical wrongs, discrimination, colonization, dispossessions that needed to be addressed. So that's the first purpose of the declaration. The second purpose is to reaffirm equal enjoyment of all rights by indigenous peoples. So bringing in the text all the fundamental human rights and freedom that every single human being had been and continue to enjoy. So that's the second purpose of that text. The third purpose of the text is to restore indigenous people control over their destiny. I'm trying to get my That's better. Oh. Can you, is the screen still visible?
It's visible. Are you able to put it full screen, Albert?
Yeah.
If you pick display mode and go full screen.
Can you see it?
We can just, but what we see is the first slide. We see all the other slides down the side. So we need to go to slideshow.
Oh, that's yes. Oh, I need to go to the slide. Yeah, you have a point. Okay, that's better, right?
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much.
Okay, so the third objective, sorry about that. Technology is to restore Indigenous peoples' control over the destiny with self-determination as the central mechanism. As I said, objective of the fourth objective of the declaration is to reconcile modern state with Indigenous peoples. Whether you read through from all the articles, this is really why that beautiful legal instrument was adopted in 2007. Now, in a nutshell, oh, now it looks like I can't. Now, in a nutshell, let me read in a summary, and I decided not to go into the content because I know it's gonna do that. What I thought is really important is to clarify all those sometimes misunderstanding surrounding the declaration. Because again, as I think I've said a couple of times, we are calling up on states and other stakeholders that it's time the declaration is implemented, fully implemented. But in doing so, we also need to address some of those misunderstandings and fears around the declarations, because otherwise we can sort of continue to believe everybody does understand it as it should be. And one of those really key misunderstandings that we need to start insisting on is that the declaration doesn't bring new right or special right for Indigenous peoples. This is a key legal argument. This instrument, literally from Article 1 to the last, reaffirm the very same rights that everyone enjoys, guaranteed for everyone, every human being, except that obviously it does reformulate those rights with the way of suiting the specific condition of Indigenous people's rights. This is a technique in international law, which is very, very much used. Just like the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the instrument really doesn't have one single new right or special right for women. All that the convention does is that it reformulates those very same rights with the view to addressing the particular challenge that women face. And let me give you an example. The right to work, for instance, is a right guaranteed for many people. But the convention had to go into ensuring that when a woman is pregnant, that natural situation doesn't actually make her pay a price or enjoy less that right. So in technically speaking, it is not about writing a new right for a woman. It is reformulating that very same principle in international law with the view to suiting what we are by nature. Because what we are by nature should not be a cause for us not to enjoy right on the same footing. No one chooses to be a woman. So a woman should not pay for being just that. So that's the very same principle. And this is something I think we need to constantly and continue to explain. And it's clearly in the preamble, because the preamble says, and I quote, recognizing and reaffirming that Indigenous individuals are entitled without decrement to all human rights, and that Indigenous people possess collective rights. The second sort of principle that I sought to talk about is that indigenous rights do not threaten national unity of states. This is something which it has been on, but the declaration has been now on for 17 years, and it's time we look back at records. On contrary, and the declaration does says that the UNDRIP seeks to forge a partnership between state and indigenous people. And the preamble said clearly, convinced that the recognition of the right of indigenous people in the declaration will enhance harmonious and cooperative relation between state and indigenous people. This is something, in my view, that we have to continue underlining. The indigenous people's rights do not negatively affect equality. This is another misunderstanding, a distortion that in many quarters we are hearing now, that indigenous people are seek to put certain social categories above others, and thereby really creating the harmony in relation to equality. It is actually the other way around. It is the other way around because clearly when an individual or a group of individuals or a community do not enjoy right on the same footing, there have to be, to a certain extent, special measures with the view not to put that group above the others, but to uplift them for them to enjoy right on the same footing. This is a common misunderstanding, and it's a growing misunderstanding in current context. We need to be able to articulate and explain it very, very clearly, because it creates fears among other groups. And we can hear, including in international processes, all the controversy sometimes between indigenous peoples now and local communities and some other groups. The fourth point I wanted to make is many of the writings in the UNDRIP are part of customary international law. We need, this is key, it's very important, because you will often hear state and other stakeholders telling you the declaration isn't legally binding. Yes, the declaration by nature is not legally binding, but this declaration is reformulation or restatement of pre-existing rights. Many of these rights have crystallized into becoming general international law, meaning general practices that are accepted as law. And it is for that reason that the declaration continues to be constantly quoted and referred to, including in court cases. Otherwise, judge wouldn't really be venturing into non-legally binding instrument to ground their legal reasoning in so many judgments. One of the reasons is because many of those rights enshrined in that declaration are or have become part of general international law. We can go and do details, and I'm sure Les could go and cite some of those rights that have crystallized to that level. See, the other aspect that really I thought it was important to mention is the rights, indigenous people's rights are not just the right of minority or any other group or immigrant or local communities as we're having. Because indigenous rights are restorative rights, they seek to redress particular historical injustices. And in human rights, actually, individual or group are not awarded rights. Rights are not like gratifications. Rights are guaranteed to an individual or a group in order to protect or restore social wrong or redress social wrong. What those rights were devised for are those very specific injustices that this community have been suffering from. That is a topic which we are actually sort of, it's part of my first report as a special rapporteur to try and put and shed some light on all those narratives today about local community and other rights around the concept indigenous peoples. And then I thought to say a few words on the right to self-determination. As there is a scholar that I like reading who really made a quote, and I'm sure some of you have read his book, and who said something like the fulfillment of self-determination goal of indigenous people would constitute a completion of the process of decolonization through mechanisms that would not necessarily involve creation of new states. What this scholar actually is arguing is the indigenous people had expected their issue would be dealt with through the decolonization process. And I think I did mention that when we were having a tour in Australia with Les, that in early 60s, between 1955 and 1962, Cree Indigenous delegation opened an office in Zambia around Kahunda, who was a president, a leader of decolonization, because indigenous people could see potential in the decolonization argument, particularly that it's the decolonization argument that actually prompted the international law to construe the right to self-determination. So they had hoped, but that movement will have like a two-track. They will have probably a track of bringing into the UN hello, Patrick, can you?
Yes.
I thought you were talking to me.
Sorry. I just, I think it's fantastic. So I hate to cut anything short, but I was going to actually say maybe another few minutes, and then because sure. I can come back to the substance of this, and Les will pick up some of this too. Thank you. Yes, so the right to self-determination is really a fountain right, and I keep saying that, from which flows other rights. And without that right, actually state will not be able to deliver on so many. It's also an enabling rights, because it enables indigenous people to decide for themselves. It really shifts the balance of power in the hand of indigenous people. So I won't touch so much on the free, prior, informed consent, just to say 3 points, major important point. Is the procedural rights that must serve other rights. You would hear is a veto right, often it's been portrayed as a veto right. It shouldn't really, technically speaking, be, because even when a community hold its consent, there are options beyond. They can go back to negotiation, there can be judicial review, or you can put end to the project or pause a dialogue for some point. That is a technical element. And it's actually part of the right to self-determination. And it's a widely cited article, sort of rights, one of the widely cited, and I'm sure Les will go on the point. Let me finish this and really say something which I repeated during my tour about the principle of equality, non-discrimination, self-determination of nation and people, and international friendly relations. These are pillars on which the international order, role-based international order, has been built. It's on the same principle that the world that we know today has been built. What we are seeing in global context is a glimpse of what the world will look like if these principles were to collapse. They have not collapsed yet. They may be a little bit shaken, but we can already see a glimpse of that world, which would be a world of the
pool of the powerful, the richer taking or claiming or getting whatever they want to get. What this is really, really important for Indigenous people is that Indigenous people have been telling the world how hurtful it is to be discriminated and not to be listened to be considered as weak by the powerful. I think today is the time for the world to sort of refocus and reaffirm the importance of human rights. And that for every single state must start at home. It's when it starts at home, then it's then reflected on the international scene. And I think all people should be equal in order to guarantee, nations should be equal in order to guarantee international friendly relations. Let me really finish by saying that the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People in 1 minute, it's one of those three mechanisms really of Indigenous people established by the United Nations. There is a permanent forum. Les will talk about them surely. The expert mechanism on the right of Indigenous people and the Special Rapporteur. The Special Rapporteur mandate is in fourfold, and that will be my last point, is that it receives communications, complaint from individual or communities that then the Special Rapporteur can process and communicate with state on those complaints. The Special Rapporteur undertakes 2 annual studies, thematic study, one for the United Nations General Assembly and one for the Human Rights Council. This year, as many of you might have seen, we are undertaking 2 studies on recognition and land demarcation with a view to assessing state practices 70 years after the adoption of the United Nations Declaration. The third aspect of the Special Rapporteur mandate is to undertake country studies, country visit. The country visits are on request of a Special Rapporteur, but they have to be accepted by concerned countries. So far, it has not really, we have sent out a couple of visits, and we're waiting for state to get back to us. And the fourth pillar of the Special Rapporteur mandate, it includes capacity building, awareness raising, and it's probably part of what I'm doing right now, whereby we are requested to contribute to spreading the knowledge, to spreading the word about Indigenous people's rights and makes a point to different stakeholders. I thank you, Patrick, and I apologize for taking a few extra minutes.
No, thank you, Albert. That was terrific. And I should just very quickly say that we had a webinar last week that looked at the role of UN special procedures. So I'd recommend people look at that if they want to learn more about the role. But it's a privilege for us to have you with us, Albert, as the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And thank you very much for a really excellent presentation. I will speak no longer except to say I think that Les will elaborate now a bit more on some of the rights in the Declaration and the significance of the Declaration. So Les, we're also very honoured to have you here with us today, and I think I'll say no more by way of introduction, I think, and just let you take the floor.
Thanks very much, Patrick, and thank you very much, Albert, Dr. Barume, who had the opportunity to speak first, because 2 weeks ago when we did our tour, I was speaking first and Dr. Barume second, and I'm quite sure that I was using up the time and limiting what was available to Dr. Barume and for the audience to come back at. So I'm in second speaker now, and I understand what it's like to try and get all this information in such a short space of time. I'm going to really emphasize some very few points. So I'm not going to have complete coverage in great detail or any sort of detail, but emphasize a few points. The first thing I wanted to emphasize was about the importance of the declaration. I noticed some comments there saying, someone was actually saying it's just ink on paper because it's not working for a certain group and so on. And it's a pity that that might be the way in which people see the declaration. And I've had similar thing to me, people challenging me, well, how does it put food on my table? When in fact, the human rights is a much different engagement, and it's important not to belittle, I think, what the human rights agenda is about on a global basis. It's been working very well in the last 80 years to before 1945, where basically rights were of individuals and so on were just overridden by empirical interests. So let me get to my presentation. I have a screen to share with you, which I'll start off now. And can I just get a thumbs up that the screen's up? Yes, good. So you can see there, this was on 2007. It was before the declaration was put up for adoption, and in the middle there in the grey uniform is the President of the General Assembly, who we were meeting with to talk about the vote going ahead on the declaration on it. So that's just a beginning of the presentation to show where we're going. So my message, now I'm jumping, I've lost control of my screen here. Here we go. Let me get back to where I should be. Here we go. My message is it's a powerful instrument, right? And it's not like an armament. It's actually having a big impact when you look at it on the global level. And when you participate in international meetings and things that are going on, you can see that in fact, Indigenous peoples collectively are consistently making headway. And as Albert indicated, the problem comes in relation to the domestic situations where states are just not willing to change course from the history that it has been involved in. And that's the challenge for it. But accept that the declaration is a powerful instrument. It is being put to use, and it can be put to more use if people got to understand, I think, what international law, human rights, and so on is about, and used it to favour. If you've got a government that has ears, the human rights argument can, in fact, influence a government very strongly. In Australia, I think we've got a government that's got ears. Unfortunately, it puts its hands over the ears, but we've got a democracy here that's functioning, or part democracy, and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, if people used arguments coming from not only the Declaration, but other instruments that have arisen out of the Declaration, or other findings or conclusions or developments in international law arising from the Declaration. And Dr. Barume was referring to self-determination. That is evolving very quickly in international law. If you Google self-determination of peoples now, you'll see it, all the responses you're getting about Indigenous people's right to self-determination. So it's actually getting a much more detailed movement going on. And I say, as you can see there, sorry, I'm getting the sound coming over, but the declaration itself is backed by the UN treaty. If you read the UN treaty, you almost see the declaration in it, embodied in it. And so the problem that has been historical since 1945 is that Indigenous peoples were an invisible population to international community deliberately, because for states, Indigenous peoples are a population that have been hidden or kept from profile. So it's backed by the UN treaty. All the things we want under the declaration and articulated specifically in the declaration are backed up in the UN treaty itself, as well as the human rights treaties that have been adopted since the 1960s, particularly the Bill of Rights I've mentioned, is which is the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And the second paragraph, I make a point that Indigenous peoples consider the declaration, this is working at the national and international level, to be the mainstay for their development, to make progress, to get things to happen. The declaration is there and it's put down very heavily on the table as to why states need to change. And also the second part of the second sentence in that paragraph, the United Nations itself every year is passing a declaration, quite a large resolution now, consisting of a number of pages, I think 7 or 8 pages, each paragraph an action that states should be taking to ensure that Indigenous peoples get the attention and the changes that are needed. Why isn't it happening? People will ask, of course, and that's because while the international community supports, was this jumping to the, sorry, I'm going to the second page, Claire. I don't know if you've got control. I think I'm supposed to have control.
Yeah, I think you've got control, Les. Yeah.
Right. Yes. For some reason it's freezing. I wanted to emphasize human rights about they're inherent to everybody. There's not people on this earth who don't have these human rights, all human rights. It's just that their rights are not able to be enjoyed. So it's no case of us as Indigenous people saying, we are denied human rights or we don't have human rights. We have them. What is happening is that they're not being promoted and protected. And who should be promoting and protecting human rights? Well, under the international system, it's the states who had that responsibility. So I'll just repeat that the principles of human rights are that universal and inalienable, they're indivisible and interdependent, and they're equal and non-discriminatory. So these are the footholds that we have to follow in going through. It keeps coming to the screen. Sorry. It's freeze again. Here we go. Right, so then I talk about the obligations of states. Oh, wait a minute, it's another screen. So we hear often a declaration is not a treaty because treaties are legally binding. Once a state signs a treaty, it has legal obligations by that treaty. But a declaration, you see the paragraph there, is an aspirational document, and we're constantly reminded of that. But in fact, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a human rights standard, right? And it's a standard that has now been accepted by the rest of the world. The United Nations itself has accepted it. So any member state that is not accepting that as a standard is defying the rest of the world. So collectively, states back these rights. Individually, I think they have a real problem about standing up to act on these rights. So I won't go further on that one. Once again, I have to wander back to my page. I don't know why it freezes like this. Okay. Obligations of states. This is clearly embedded in the United Nations. Member states have obligations to promote and protect human rights. The international system on human rights and international law places no other entity responsible for promoting and protecting human rights, or at least protecting human rights, and that's the states. So the states, if they don't meet their obligations, then the peoples who are being denied their rights have to suffer because of the state. So states like Australia need to be reminded. I've never heard them say it for a decade now about their obligations under international law to protect human rights, right? I also got a footnote there to say that the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues adopted a general comment in 2009. And in that comment, if you read it, it's about 4 pages, it concludes that the declaration should be afforded a superior status by the Permanent Forum in relation to national laws, and that it had a duty to spread this view over the world. So they basically found the way the declaration is drafted, it is drafted like a treaty, not like a normal human rights standard is drafted, but in many of the articles, the second paragraph says, states shall do this, states shall do that. And that doesn't appear in standards. That's actually what appears in treaties, those words, who's going to do it and what it is they should be do it. So again, the power of Indigenous peoples at the international level can continue to advance to say, look, we're not just talking about here when states are going to be ready, they have an obligation to so let's get to the declaration. This screen is really taking up a lot of time. Can't get it to move. Here we go again. There we go. Okay, so there very quickly, you just see the earliest draft in 1993. There were 9 parts. These are the components of it. So for those who haven't yet opened up on the declaration, you can see that what it's covering in there. It's not covering every human right. It's covering those rights that Indigenous peoples feel have been denied and which they feel are being taken for granted by other peoples in the state, and which are important to their development. So you see there self-government, land and other property rights, and so on are all part of the things that originally started out in 93. And even that earliest draft had been strongly influenced or preempted by Indigenous peoples preparing documents on the thing. This is just a view of the gallery when the General Assembly voted on the declaration in 2007. You can see that Indigenous peoples filled up all the seats in there for the session, and it's a pretty unusual thing to see lots of people in the gallery sessions. Right, so I'm going to go through now very quickly to talk about different components. So there's a number of preambular paragraphs and articles refer to equality of peoples. In this case, I'm just going to make a reference to, and by the way, these documents are available to everybody. So one Article 2 says Indigenous peoples are free and equal to all other peoples. And this was more or less the title of the lecture tour that the Special Rapporteur and I undertook around the eastern capitals of Australia 2 weeks ago. Also, it says in there, Indigenous peoples have the right not to be have the right to self-determination, and then in Article 8 goes on to say had the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. And I did ask one of the genocide webinars about whether Article 8 is the definition of genocide, because the word genocide was taken out of the drafting of the declaration, but a description of genocide was put in its place. But that's an acknowledgement that in fact Indigenous peoples, and in Australia that's what's happening with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, even with closing the gap, are being forced to assimilate to the values and goals of the other peoples in Australia, or the citizens of Australia, when Indigenous peoples, having been here for 60,000 years, in fact are entitled to have inherent values and aspirations which are less. I'll go to the next screen, hopefully, which deals with Indigenous institutions and property. In there, in the middle paragraph, I'm talking about that states shall establish, in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, a fair, independent, impartial, open and transparent process to give recognition to Indigenous peoples' laws, traditions customs and land tenure systems, and to adjudicate rights of Indigenous peoples relating to the lands, territories and resources. I've always pointed out that's Article 27. Article 27 is a key article. It talks about adjudication of disputes. It's not about how states say my way or the highway. It's about having a fair, independent arbitration of disputes. And I want to emphasise that. And then close to the bottom, it talks about Indigenous peoples have the right to determine that for themselves their structures and membership of their institutions in accordance with their own procedures, and that includes juridical systems. I'll go to the next screen, which is about treaties. The references in the declaration were more or less made to the historical treaties, where some of the treaty holders felt that they had rights in those treaties which were not included in as human rights in the declaration, and they wanted to ensure that those rights, inherent rights, were also protected. And that's what the declaration says, that the Indigenous peoples have the right to enforcement of treaties and other constructive arrangements concluded with states in that process. The next one refers to political development. This is a very strong issue for me, because we talk about development, people will readily look at social and cultural development, not so much economic development, and certainly not political development. And yet political development is our problem. You know, we're not being allowed to actually engage with states, to actually organise to engage with states, to have our own system of decision making and so on. And you'll see that reflected in the articles that are before you there. I'm looking particularly at Article 18 in themselves. It says to have the right to participate in decision making through representatives chosen by themselves, as well as to maintain and develop their own Indigenous decision making institutions. And I'll go then to the next page, which is says, for lands and development, Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development of the use of their lands or territories and other resources. States shall cooperate in good faith through Indigenous peoples' own representative institutions to obtain consent for any projects affecting their lands, territories and other resources, particularly mineral, water and other resources. And this, of course, has been one of the main areas in which there has been activities going on since the declaration, where people have sought to have free, prior, informed consent respected, and it's had limited success. It's led to states saying, oh, we're willing to consult, but that was their position even before the declaration, or before we went to the UN. States said they were willing to consult. So, you know, we need to get serious about what these words say and what they actually mean in the process. Now, I know people are anxiously shifting around their chairs, that time's running out, so I've made this deliberately short. As I said, those things I've just quickly shot through are available there for you to go back and go over. And I expect that we are going to have a second webinar before too long, in maybe a week's time, where we can actually spend a bit more time on some of these details. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Les, and thank you. I think it is a very big challenge to try and condense such a significant document and such a significant history into a short amount of time. And I think also with Albert's presentation, maybe we can come back to some of those issues in the discussion. And also, as you say, we think it's very important to come back in another webinar, we hope next week. But I think where you finished off, Les, is a very good place then for Ngarra to pick up and to describe the processes that they're involved in Victoria, a treaty making process or looking at treaty making processes, supervising, engaging in treaty making processes and truth telling processes. So Ngarra, perhaps you can share with us what's happening in Victoria at the moment, and then how you feel it relates to or the UN Declaration, and how the UN Declaration can relate and inform those processes and your engagement with the state. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. And hello, everyone. I'm Ngarra Murray, and I'm a proud Wamba, Yorta Yorta, Dirro and Jar Jar Wurrung woman. And I was elected to the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria in 2019 as a Metropolitan member when it was first established, and in 2023 I became the co-chair alongside Ruben Berg. Thank you, Patrick and Claire from the Diplomacy Training Program for organising this webinar for us. And I want to acknowledge Special Rapporteur Dr. Albert Barume and Les Malezer. You are each so dedicated in your respective fields, and I recognise the work that you've done. So yeah, it's an honour to join you on the webinar tonight. I'm joining from the sacred lands of the Wurundjeri people in Naarm in Melbourne, and our people have a deep and sacred relationship with our lands. And I pay respect to the ancestors, elders and family clans of the Wurundjeri here. And we are many distinct nations here in Victoria and across our country. And I offer my respect and honour all tribes across their tribal territories, and also acknowledging all people online today and the countries where you join us from. We are at a pivotal moment in Victoria as we work towards the very first treaty in this country, and it's a moment generations of our people have fought for. My family in particular has been fighting for over 8 generations. And as we say, we stand on the shoulder of giants and our ancestors and our elders and those people that came before us. So whether it was the old people in the frontier wars, or our resistance fighters, those who have fought hard for land and water rights, and those who've petitioned previous governments or marched and protested in the streets, raising their fists, those that lifted up their peers to keep community, culture and country strong, even in the face of immense hardships and discrimination here in our own country. And the legacy of our people in Victoria is one of powerful resistance and resilience and pride, and we have been at the heart of the Black political movement in Australia. So this moment for us is a testament to the strength and survival and the unbreakable spirit of our people. And their fight has made it possible for our voice to be heard louder than ever today, and their stories continue to inspire us and keep that fire in our belly. Nearly 10 years of preparatory work and speaking with our communities to create a strong treaty process, treaty negotiations with the state are now underway. So I'll talk quickly to the First Peoples Assembly, and I'll give a bit of an update of where we're at in this part of the country. So for those that don't know, the First Peoples Assembly in Victoria is a democratically elected body of Aboriginal peoples from all over Victoria, and we are elected by our communities. Although we do work across a wide range of topics, our primary goal is negotiating treaty, the first one in this nation's history. And we have 33 members on the Assembly that all represent their communities and the unique needs of their communities. And all of the elected members are traditional owners of country in Victoria, but we represent all First Peoples, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Victoria. Treaty is a big concept and one that means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And we've spent a lot of time hearing ideas and distilling those ideas into what treaty will be. But for us in Victoria, treaty is a movement, and I spoke a little to the legacy, and you know, we are born into it. The treaty in Victoria, so the first treaty is what we call the statewide treaty, which is the broad overarching treaty negotiated between the Assembly and the state. And this treaty will look at ways to ensure Aboriginal communities always have the ability to use local knowledge to come up with practical solutions at a community level. And when it comes to our business, our matters, our communities are the experts. And that is why we need the freedom and power to make decisions about our lives on our own terms. And whether it's caring for country and overseeing ongoing truth-telling and healing efforts, or helping to improve the way services like health and housing and education for our people are delivered in our communities, we see the statewide treaty as a practical way to get better outcomes. And we also want to expand the roles and responsibilities of the First Peoples Assembly so it has real decision-making powers when it comes to our business, to our matters. And I'm really proud to say, you know, that after years of building the framework and mechanisms, after thousands of conversations, cups of teas, community dinners and treaty circles, time spent on the road, building our electoral roll and cultivating a staunchly independent organisation, you know, we've begun treaty negotiations, and we will fight for the first treaty in this country this year. So that's the first statewide treaty, but there's also going to be traditional owner treaties, and they're a very important piece of our puzzle. These are treaties that individual tribes or traditional owner groups, nations will negotiate when they are ready in their own way, at their own pace. And for example, many tribes in Victoria, but the Gunditjmara tribe in the West might have different treaty aspirations with different priorities and needs to the Yorta Yorta people in the Northeast or the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people in the city. And traditional owner treaties will be aimed at protecting inherent rights, recognition of sovereignty, the fight for lands and waters, protection of sacred sites, and centering place-based specific outcomes. At the Assembly, when we say self-determination, we mean control over our own cultural, social, and economic futures, as set out in the United Nations Declaration. And while our work and the ways we got here have evolved over time, we have our own robust systems in place, and the Assembly's work is really underpinned by the Declaration. And as a political representative organisation, the Assembly is self-determination in action. While different communities and mobs and states will have their own system and ways, acknowledging we have other countrymen and women online today, they'll have their own system and ways of achieving self-determination. There is common ground in much of what the Declaration sets out. So UNDRIP recognises our right to determine our own governance structure, and in particular, the Assembly's paid close attention to Article 3 and 4 and have put them into practice. So if you look at Article 3 and Article 4 and exercising our rights to self-determination and our rights to self-government, and that's what we've built over the last 10 years. So you can see that for the past few years, we've not only used this as a principle, but have actually deployed it in real and tangible terms. And I can give a recent example of that just quickly. Our additional pathways to reserve seating process is one of the ways that we utilise that right. So while there are state government recognised registered Aboriginal parties, so tribes that are recognised by the state government, we knew our mob had to define ourselves outside of how the state did. But for too long, that dictated to who we were as a people. And I'm not going to go into how that's problematic, but trust me, it is. So we knew we had to create our own system of representation that was determined by us, by our people. So just last year, we introduced an additional seat to the Assembly for the Wamba peoples that come from the state's northwest. And they are mob who at the time did not have status, but needed a seat at the table. So we created our own system that determined who must be a part of this process. And we did it in a way of freely deciding our political status and makeup. Treaty needs to be an inclusive process for both blackfellas and whitefellas in this country. So from our end, UNDRIP and self-determination is how we ensure inclusivity. Another element, just quickly, on the work that we do, when we talked about having treaty, we had to have truth. So for us, we desperately needed truth-telling in this country. It's long overdue for a truth-telling process, and acknowledging, I think, former Commissioner Kevin Bell there, I can see you online. But that's why one of the first things the Assembly did when we elected was create the Yurok Justice Commission. And the Yurok Justice Commission is the first formal truth-telling process in this country, and examining the historical and ongoing injustices experienced by our people in Victoria. And their role was really to establish an official record of the impact of colonisation. They were mandated to develop a shared understanding amongst Victorians of the impact of colonisation and the diversity and strength and resilience of our people here in Victoria. Another part of their mandate is to make recommendations for healing, system reform, and practical changes to law, policy, and education. So these are all matters that we'll also address in our treaties. And the work of the Yurok Justice Commission has been profound. And the Commission invited many, many different people from all over the state to tell their truths about this state, whether it was from 100 years ago to the impacts of colonisation and atrocities and injustices that have happened to our people. There were many people that have contributed to the process, and there's been some really powerful submissions and stories that shed a light on the true nature of Victoria's history. And there are a lot of themes from land injustice, social injustice, themes of health, education, housing. So there were some amazing themes that come out of that inquiry. So Yurok, the Truth Telling Commission, is wrapping up in a few months in an official way and handing down its final report, but the Assembly is looking at ways we can embed ongoing truth telling. As part of the final push for truth, one of the commissioners, Commissioner Lovett, he's doing a walk for truth from Portland, so where colonisation in Victoria began, and the Convincing Ground, which is the first recorded massacre of Aboriginal people. He's walking from Portland to Melbourne. So I encourage you all online or here in Victoria or in this country to take part in this historic moment and check out the UROC website. I think, Claire, you're going to put some links in the chat. So there is treaty and truth, two ways we action self-determination right here at home in Victoria. They are not small tasks. It has not been easy, but they are immensely important and ones we work on day in and day out. It has been a monumental feat to get to this point, to fight for the first treaty in this country. And I think I'll leave it there. I understand there's going to be a bit of a Q&A, so if there's any questions, but I do encourage you to please check out the links for the Assembly and for the treaty in Victoria, so you can keep up to date. But thank you very much for listening. I know we're running out of time, Patrick, but thank you all.
Thanks, Ngarra. No, I think that was very succinct and very powerful. And I think now we wanted to go into a part of the webinar where maybe you could discuss and engage with Les and Albert about how the relevance of the declaration to what you're doing and others are doing in Victoria. I think it'll be very interesting and powerful for people to hear about that. So I pass the floor back to you, really, Ngarra.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Yep, so I'm happy to ask a couple of questions to Les and Dr. Barume. And yeah, I think I'll ask questions and then there'll probably be a couple of general questions from people online. So I think Les and Dr. Barume, how can UNDRIP be implemented or integrated into processes of truth-telling or treaty making at the community or state level for us here in Australia, for example? Maybe I'll go to you, Les.
I have questions myself on whether truth-telling is in fact a right in itself. Rather, I regard it as being a process towards achieving a right. But in the case of truth-telling, I presume it's a process towards treaty, which is negotiated as equals at the party because of the information that comes up from the truth-telling process. But it's still a process up until the point of what happens when it's taken up with the states per se, in this case, the Victorian government, but also we know Victorian government is subject to the national government. So while I don't expect that it is possible for the national government to prohibit agreement making as such. I don't say that's what will happen, but there is a challenge remaining for a state government arrangement to be able to have the strength of international law through the state government's position on it. It's a bit complicated on that. So, but so truth-telling, from what I know of it so far, because we had part of the treaty here in Queensland, where I am, and so on, is sorry, I don't know if someone's deliberately trying to break in, but in the discussion, but it serves two purposes, as I understand, like with the Stolen Generations apology. One is truth-telling is actually a benefit to the people who've been the victims of colonialism in different ways and so on. Truth-telling appeases that. Then does truth-telling then identify or lead to targets being met? And I refer to what Mick Dodson said a number of years ago when he was Treaty Commissioner in the Northern Territory, that before sitting down at the table with government, there need to be two acknowledgements by government. One is that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is acknowledged by the government. And the second is that the sovereignty of the people to be able to speak as equals at the table with the state needs to be recognised before the negotiation can occur. So for me, it's still a question mark, because I'm following the process that's happening in Victoria and the truth-telling process, but I remain uncertain about what is the goal that is there. What is the goal? And I think it's in seeing the goal that we get to understand what is the human right that's being expressed. You know, we could say self-determination, for example, is the goal, and then it would be a case, well, okay, how does that get expressed as a result from that? So I see it as being a step in a process, but it's not the goal. And as you might have picked up in the declaration, it doesn't say that states shall use treaties to protect and promote human rights. It says constructive arrangements. And so I say widely, it could be treaties, it could be a combination of treaties and legislation. It could be a combination of treaties, legislation, and business deals, you know, because finances is a big question in resolution of complaints from Indigenous peoples. So that's probably where I'll leave it at, is to say, I'd like to know more about the end to be achieved. I'm quite happy with the process, but I can't tick it off until I know where it's meant to go.
Yeah, thanks, Les. And the UROC are due to deliver the final reform report in June. So we're all looking forward to reading that final report. I'll go to you, Albert, around the second question we had, which was, what do you think are the responsibilities of the state in relation to promoting understanding of the United Declaration rights on Indigenous peoples?
Thanks, Ngarra. I really appreciate it. I think states, in terms of responsibility, we need to put, I think, the question into sort of the UNDRIP context. And the UNDRIP context, as I said, I would like to highlight three things. I think the state has an obligation under the UNDRIP to acknowledge wrongs. It's really an international obligation. It's underwritten in the declaration. A state has a duty to acknowledge the wrong, because there is no way you can address or redress something you as an institution or subject of international law that you have not recognized. That's the first aspect. The second aspect, I think, within the UNDRIP is the state is bound by the UNDRIP to guide every single process through Indigenous people, cultural, institution, and practices. It's a starting point of trying to rebuild the internal self-pride of Indigenous people. It's an internal filigrane in the declaration to give back that pride of Indigenous people that they lost for long by the fact of other people deciding what is better and good for them. So the obligation is really to put Indigenous people on structures and governance structure at the center of the process. That's the second aspect. The third aspect, I think, under the declaration is it should not appear as if states are acting outside international obligation, as if states are acting through a logic of I would say maybe literally doing a favor to Indigenous people. This is a real international obligation for which state we have to remain accountable. And there have really to be mechanism of accountability built in any sort of treaty or discussion about the truth telling. It cannot be seen through the path of I would say an administrative decision. I think legally speaking is higher than that. It might be given a clear legal framework that enable sort of accountability and enforcement.
Yes, thank you, Albert. Some really valid points. I'll go to one more question, then I might pass back to Patrick to moderate the general questions. But between you, Les and Albert, any advice or good practices to share on building understanding of UNDRIP at the community level and with governments, even local governments? I'll throw that question to you, maybe Les first.
Yes, thanks, Ngarra. Of course, it's always an important question. And what we have done with our organisation have always tried to focus on community, and we do from time to time challenge government, but our task is to inform and educate people in the community. When I was co-chair of National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, we had a program running around Australia to tell people about the declaration, inform them on it, and so on. But unfortunately, the money we had was had run out, and the government refused to provide any more support to the National Congress. So we couldn't continue on with it. It's something I've taken up with the Commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Social Justice, where they have copies of the declaration itself to be distributed around the community. It's a limited supply, but there's still copies that could get around. And of course, I am trying nowadays to say to every person in the audience that I speak to is get a copy of the declaration and put it in your pocket. If you can't get a printed copy, print it off on a computer and get it, and every day read one article or something to get to understand it. Because I go back to where I started, it is actually a powerful instrument. It is being used very effectively at the national level. It's at the moment, states don't seem to be paying enough attention. You know, it says all the things, all the right things. I mean, it is the document that Indigenous peoples fought very, very hard for since the 1970s. So, yes, if there's any way we can make people even more aware, and these webinars, you know, is part of that attempt, then that should be the case, because I think there's too many people who are just citing the declaration or the words free, prior, informed consent, but actually haven't had a look into it to see the descriptions and how they work and so on. So I would hope that people actually educate themselves on understanding the document by having it at their side. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And yes, have your little copy. I take mine no matter where I go. And when I go into my treaty negotiations, I'm armed and skilled and informed. But over to you, Albert.
Yeah, just two little things really to pull it point. I think the first is to invest and really going in the same direction as Les, is to invest in the education of communities. These are rights, and rights are claimed. This is a principle. Rights are not granted on silver platters, and these remain realities. The delivering on right by states is highly dependent on how the right holders are claiming those rights. So that's no doubt about that. So we need to arm Indigenous peoples equipped with the language of rights and claiming those rights seriously. And particularly, I think, really investing in the youth. We need to develop the right tool for Indigenous youth to understand this as rights. And let me make a point, which we were actually talking about it yesterday. We had a coordination meeting between the 3 UN mechanisms on Indigenous people's rights live here. And one of the things, we have these risks of isolating human rights, putting human rights in a silo and locking the door, whereby we would be told discussion on climate change, discussion on biodiversity are not human rights dialogue. We need to reformat our Indigenous people activists and non-Indigenous people youth to understand the right to a safe environment, the right to preserve the natural environment, including the biodiversity. They are framed in human rights instruments. that actually, including the UNPFII, are derivations of international human rights sort of instrument. That's the first one. The second point I want to make is really the role and obligation of the state. A state has the duty to promote, protect, and respect human rights. State need to continue. State has an obligation to educate its population on human rights. And this is often an obligation that we leave aside, that we have not been pressing states on to invest resources including in human rights education, particularly targeting the specific right holder. So for me, it's really continue to remind state of their obligation to promote human rights, invest in human rights education, and enable the right holder to claim for the right and equip them with the right understanding. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's really powerful. Yeah, so important that they do have an obligation, and it is a global promise to respect and protect and fulfill and empower Indigenous peoples all across this globe around their human rights. And yes, it's important our young people learn as well. We're preparing our young people for what they will inherit. So it's important that they're armed and skilled and informed on their rights. Patrick, that was the first few questions I had, but I might pass back to you because I'd say there's a few more questions for Dr. Albert and Les, but I'll pass back to you to moderate.
Thanks, Ngarra.
Yeah, thanks, Ngarra, and thank you, Albert and Les. There's a lot of chat and a lot of questions, a number of invitations I see to you, Albert, to visit other countries in the region as well. I know that we can't go into that now, but there's a process for
Patrick,
both
while
private
speaking,
and official visits for the is it? I think I've seen a couple of questions about the role of local government and also what can be done. Perhaps, Albert, you could speak to what your role as Special Rapporteur is in guiding or providing advice to states and government institutions at different levels about how to implement the declaration. And there are questions also, I guess, about what pressure can come below also in terms of advocacy around implementation of the declaration. So there are processes in Queensland that have been stopped, for example, Ngarra, and there was a request for advice from you in relation to what you think can be done in relation to the situation there. But also, Les, that's very close to you as well. So I think maybe we spend the last 5 or 7 minutes, perhaps we begin with Albert saying, or sharing what your role is, Albert, as Special Rapporteur in helping Indigenous peoples, but also states to implement this key international agreement. And then perhaps any advice we can get from our advocates and activists, Ngarra and Les, in what can be done to help mobilize the necessary political will domestically for implementation. The international questions, friends, let's leave for another webinar. But so I'll pass to you, Albert, first, if I can.
Thank you, Patrick. I've actually shared with Claire it's like 4 slides, very short presentations that I generally present on the mandates. I've shared it into the chat. It's something which I think it could be for those who are interested to look into. But let me just say a couple of things. And one of those things to say is, as I indicated, the 4 pillars in terms of activity of the Special Rapporteur mandates is on capacity building, awareness raising, and that can include a state seeking the Special Rapporteur to comment on a draft policy, on a draft law, or coming in to train, government officials, taking part in training, working with national human rights institutions, developing materials, and doing what we are doing here. it is in that pillar as well that fits what we call today academic visit. Academic visit, I would call, is similar to what we did recently with Les. So a special rapporteur comes in a country, not invited by the states, because those invitations are getting increasingly almost impossible to organize for two reasons. The first is that the states increasingly are unwilling to be taken under that scrutiny of a special rapporteur and having really a thorough report. So states, not many are willing to do that. But the UN is also getting almost bankrupt. So we were told at the beginning of the year that we get like 2 visits a year. Now we are being told we might, if we like, we get 1 a year. So you really can report on a global scale by doing one. So it actually tells you how critically important it has become, those academic visits. So it can be an invitation by an Indigenous people organization, like you just have to be, well organized. I wouldn't call excellently organized like Les did, because Les was like is meticulously well organized. It's so that it really sort of yields there is the expected result. And it can be, as I said, the National Human Rights Institution, it can be a non-governmental organization, it can be a university, it can be states themselves, it can be local governments who would, they're not seeking for an official visit, but they really want to be helped. But I do believe that bringing up the knowledge back to where it matters will continue, particularly as we engage in the phase of fully implementing the declaration. I've put on that chart. I hope Clark can share those that short PowerPoint to everybody on this chat. It has an email. This is my last point actually to mention. The official Special Rapporteur emails through which we receive communications. Communications, I think in my view, are still central, because we as a mechanism, particularly the Special Rapporteur, is really to enhance the voice of Indigenous peoples. And that mechanism enables the mandate holder to directly communicate with the states on a given case. And you can collect that information, including during an official visit. Whatever, the way we get the information we communicate with state on doesn't really matter. And so we need, and as I said, we need to be creative as the official channel are increasingly strained or constrained. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you. Ngarra?
Yeah, I'll speak to a couple of things in the chat. So the progress of treaty negotiations across Australia, it varies with states and territories, with some, making significant advancements, like for us, for example, in Victoria, while others are yet to start any formal processes. And I can only speak to our jurisdiction and experience with the state here in Victoria, but the push for treaty across the country is growing, and but political changes and the different government priorities influence how we move forward, even the global ecosystem, when you look what's happening globally in politics. But I think no matter the challenges, we're going to keep pushing until treaties are a reality for us across this land that we now call Australia. And we're going to have to secure a treaty, most likely within a hostile government. We've seen Queensland, and I think, Les, you can speak to Queensland and parliamentary sovereignty and the repeal of the legislation, but we're going to have a multi-layered political strategy. All that goodwill we've seen in the referendum, start to harness that towards treaty, and we know we have a lot of support at that level. And there's a lot of work we have to do to combine advocacy, mobilisation, political negotiation to hold the narrative and to continue to build support, neutralise the opposition. So there's strategies we have to have in place for that. But I might pass to Les, because in Queensland it's a very different story, even with our brothers and sisters in Aotearoa with the Maori mob and what's happening in their country. But I know we've looked internationally at the different examples to build the best, what we say, analogy of the best possum skin cloak for our circumstances, made up of all those learnings and successes of treaties. And there's a lot of eyes on us. It's the first sort of modern treaty in a couple of decades, but we'll keep pushing till we have a reality of treaties across this land. But I'll pass to you, Les, kind of from the Queensland perspective.
Thanks, Patrick. Will I proceed? Yeah, okay. Yes, certainly. Thanks, Ngarra, for that. And yes, what lessons do we learn from Queensland, I think, is the answer to that. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that strategically, I think when we're dealing with the state, we have to accept that the state will alternate between supportive and hostile, and everything that's been built up over the last 50 years around self-determination has basically been knocked down, and unfortunately we're not seeing resurrection in the cycles of late in the last 10, 20 years. And so that's one of my concerns there. But it comes back to, I think, you know, and I've personally arrived at the situation of where I think people who go into political leadership of the state, that is parliamentarians, really should be questioned in relation to their support for human rights. You know, that in a country like Australia, I know there's a lot of other places listening in from Asia and so on, but in a place in Australia, it's not an unreasonable expectation to think that parliamentarians should affirm not loyalty to the Queen or King, but their commitment to equality of the peoples, you know, human rights. And it should be a sort of a document that they sign off on and before they go seeking for votes. Now, I know that taking control of the state and how it operates is probably an impossible task for anyone at any time, but and even more so for Indigenous peoples. But I've always been encouraged to look to where the root of the problem and deal with the root of the problem, because dealing with the surface problems, they recur over time. You know, deaths in custody is a good example. I worked on the Royal Commission, and the rate of deaths in custody is increasing. The rate of incarceration is increasing. So what's the root problem? And the answer's already been given, but nobody bothers on looking it up and answer and going by volume 1 of the Royal Commission report from 1991. But it's all in there about empower the community will lead to less people before the justice system. But no one thinks that way. So, but I'm not a fatalist, and I'm not negative. I'm always optimistic in that sense. And as I started off in the presentation, the declaration is a powerful instrument, and we have quite a large amount of, what would you call it, grip or leverage in the UN system. We have the Special Rapporteur before us. We have the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. We have the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. We've got the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous peoples, and so on. And not only that, but there's the mainstream. There's the treaty bodies, the human rights treaty bodies, and Australia is currently preparing to go before the Universal Periodic Review. Happens every 5 years by the UN, and so on. So these are places for fair consideration and judgment, because only states themselves can commit to change. It can't be policed or forced externally under the provisions, otherwise we'd have wars all over the place. But the point is that states themselves, and identifying who the state is, and I've identified it's the politicians, it's the people who put their hands up to say, I've got the answers, I want to lead the country, are the ones to be targeted. So That's my view. And the earlier question was about local government. It's the same thing there. I mean, I think there's a lot to be achieved in land rights through local government, because there's things that local government can do by way of concession to Indigenous Peoples Association with their territories. Even if we can't get full acknowledgement at the national level about land rights, or at the state level about land rights, there can be concessions at the local government. So all of these things are very important. We've got the Commonwealth Games coming to Brisbane in 2032. Last time we had games in 1982, we protested for months and so on, and caused quite a ruckus. I don't know whether we're going to just accept, you know, the failures happening in Australia and do nothing, or whether people will say, well, we've got to do something about it. I'll leave it at that. I've covered a lot of ground, so thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, Les and Ngarra and Albert. We've gone over time. It would be easy to go on much longer too, also, because you can see the discussion and the chat and the sharing, and there is so much substance there in the declaration. So I very much hope that we can come back. I pick up, I think, in closing, a reference made by the Special Rapporteur, Dr. Albert Barume, that what is in the declaration is a response to human wrongs. It's a response to a world where might was right. And there is, at the moment, a real risk that we are returning to a world where might is right. And those with power feel they can deploy that power with impunity. And I think we've heard very powerfully from the speakers today that knowledge and understanding of rights, of international law, of the obligations of states is incredibly important to build and share. And it's from that, perhaps, that we can maintain and continue to build a world that respects justice and rights. So we hope this webinar as part of that process, Ngarra and Albert in making that possible, for being here today, and we hope we can ask you to come back and join us again. I thank all the participants who've been very patient with us, for all of those who've contributed comments and questions. We will share all the presentations, we will share the comments, we will try and respond to questions we haven't